More and more parents are starting to be aware of the indoctrination happening in our school systems. Unfortunately, many realize it after their kids have left the faith. And so Adrian's point of view is that it's time to take action and to prepare ourselves as parents for our kids to be ready for the teachings they'll face. Tonight's speaker is Adrian Toder. He's a founding member of the Ambassadors Forum, holds a master's degree in teaching, and has been studying apologetics and having discussions with unbelievers for the last 2 decades. Adrian is married, has 4 kids, and currently works as an operations manager. On behalf of the Ambassadors Forum, please welcome tonight's speaker, Adrian Toder.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Yes, my name is Adrian, and done this a few times with the Friday Night Forum, and this one kind of hits close to home for me. I'm excited to be talking about this, especially because right now I'm upstairs in my bedroom. Downstairs is some of my family, along with the middle school youth group that we run here out of our house. So hi guys downstairs. Among the people there are my kids, and especially my daughter, who kind of started off this whole topic for me. My daughter is in middle school. She's actually 6th grade, and she's fantastic. So great students, fun person. And like all the other kids in Oregon, when COVID hit, she went home, stopped studying at school, and started doing online classes. So she'd wake up in the morning, pull out her laptop just like this, and sit on a Zoom call with her teachers. And this actually made things interesting because for the first time, we kind of got a sense for who she was as a student sitting in class, as well as what her teachers were like. And it was fantastic, I thought. I mean, she had a lot of teachers that put in a lot of effort to keep learning happening, and kind of a tough time. It was a kind of, I said, a little bit weird for us and for the students and for the teachers. So nothing but props to them for the teachers that really put it out there to keep my kids learning. But something happened a few weeks into it. I would be home from work. My wife would be with them as well, and we'd start kind of, peeking in over their shoulders to what's happening inside their class. And most of the time it was fantastic. Math, science, whatever it was. But we started noticing that a lot of some of their teachers would start teaching things that were a little bit outside of the scope of the particular class they were going for. One day we were in we kind of peeked into her class in social studies, and the topic for the day was current events. There was a lot of the protests happening in downtown Portland. There were just things happening, current events, and the teacher began to give, I guess, what I would call a very one-sided, slanted indoctrination of current events. The main thrust of her lesson was America is a horrible, racist place and where we have police who purposefully target minorities based on a system that is oppressive, and that was the basic thrust of the message. I was a little bit taken aback because I give my daughter kind of over to these teachers, who then take the trust that I've given them and start to push certain views. This was, come to find out, not an especially unique situation. As the days went on, we noticed that there were more of these kinds of lessons. We're talking about how generally America, when it came to Columbus Day, the lesson on Columbus Day was not, here's a great explorer. Rather, here is this evil Columbus that came to oppress the Native Americans, and as a result, helped found a country that was evil. Some of these things kind of, for this particular teacher, stemmed around this anti-Americanism. But as it turns out, this is not unique, and it's not centered only on anti-Americanism. I challenged the teacher over email. I sent an email, very respectful, and said, I'd like to object to the lesson that you're giving my daughter. And it surprised, what came back surprised me. She was respectful as well. And rather than say, well, this is something that I feel strongly about and I wish to teach, her response was instead, this is something I feel strongly about and wish to teach, and it actually is part of the Oregon Department of Education's own curriculum. This is required teaching. And she sent me a letter, and it gave a kind of an overview of the social studies program that they're part of, and said, this is not just me doing this is everybody doing this. And I realized this is not limited to my daughter. This is not limited to Portland. This is Oregon. This is the rest of America. This is basically the thrust of teaching happening in our public schools. As it turns out, again, this focus is on this teaching that I'm talking about is part of a narrative that is very much driven and weaved through every topic that students learn. And that narrative is what I call the oppression narrative. It's a value system, and it's profoundly anti-Christian. And at its foundation, it's a Marxist idea that separates people into classes of oppressor and oppressed. And like all Marxist ideas, they are anti-Christian. So I've said something pretty strong here. I've said Marxism, oppression narrative, and I said anti-Christian. For a while, I kind of heard myself thinking these thoughts and realized maybe I'm blowing it out of proportion. Maybe I'm just, a little too sensitive. Maybe I'm a little too patriotic. I want to wave the flag around about how great America is. But the more you dig into this, the more you realize this is not about America. This is about what I would say that is really the Christian West, and that's foundation, Christianity. Here's what I mean. Dennis Prager, who's a radio host, wrote an article, and he said the following in the article. He writes this: whenever I meet adults who hold traditional values, I ask 3 questions. The first is, do you have children? If they do, my second question is, how many of them share your values? It's not common to meet people, all of whose children share their parents' traditional values. If they respond to them that any of their children don't share their values, my third question is, what happened? In every instance, these parents attribute the alienation of their children from their parents' values to college and increasingly the high school their child attended. And I personally would add, and now middle school and elementary school. Moreover, he writes, not only are these children alienated from their parents' values, they're often alienated from their parents themselves. One thing you learn when you become left wing is to have contempt for those who hold other beliefs. So statistics show that around 65% of Christian youth that go to college leave the church. So what's the link between this school indoctrination and leaving the church? Because there's a link there, and it comes from this narrative that public schools are pushing, that push all the way from kindergarten through graduate school, and how it affects our kids. So for this talk tonight, I want to explain what this oppression narrative is, how it actually affects kids, and how to answer some of the challenges. And finally, at the end, what we as families can do. And just a hint, the answer is not simply homeschooling. So let's get into it. So I want to paint the picture here that kind of gives us a better example of what a curriculum looks like in a public school system. And this one, I pick one because it's from Minnesota, but you could pick almost any state in America, and you'll get similar ideas. So this one is for social studies, and again, it covers from kindergarten to high school. And I went on their website and reviewed the curriculum, which, just as I mentioned earlier, I used to be a teacher, and I've got kind of a firsthand view of how these curriculums are rolled out. They'll be introduced to teachers. They'll go through training, and some of the topics that are taught in this curriculum are very solid. history and how to vote and how things work in our country and so on. But weaved in there like this strand that goes through every subject in school is this narrative. And here's some of the excerpts of what they're going to be learning. Middle schoolers are going to be taught about racism in relation to the criminal justice system, the evils of capitalism and social justice activism. Freshmen are taught about the evils of whiteness, Christianity, and capitalism, and asked to question their country's founding documents. Other lessons include an explanation of how systemic inequity creates barriers to accessing credit, explain how race is a social construction used to oppress people of color, and learn to embrace gender ideology. This is kindergarten through high school. Like I said, it comes from Minnesota, but you could actually get, again, pretty much any state in the union now is going to have threads of this woven throughout all their topics. Now, a lot of this may sound kind of like a word salad. All these terms, gender ideology, whiteness, and all these things that are, again, they're sort of a word salad. But as parents, grandparents, and just church members, you got to be aware of what we're up against. See, I think 10 or 20 years ago, the church kind of realized that there was kind of this new wave of atheism going through, evolution, false cults, things like this, and we started paying attention to this. But while the church was paying attention to those, this new form of anti-Christianity sprung up, and it kind of took us by surprise, I think. And most only figured it out after their kids were fully indoctrinated. I want to sound the alarm, and I don't want to let the next generation be surprised by these topics. So let's dive into it. Here's what I mean by the oppression narrative. As I said, the foundational idea of this narrative is Marxist. The idea is that the world is separated into classes of oppressor and oppressed. And as it is applied today, it pretty much says this: any group differences are a result of oppression and exploitation. So any group doing better in any way is said to be oppressing, and any group doing poorly is said to be oppressed. So this goes for racial groups, gender, sexual orientation, religious groups, etc. And this explanation is all-encompassing. It explains everything. Now, this is important because I think we can all admit there are oppressors. There are oppressed. This is not that idea that I think it's pretty clear, right? You see situations where there are oppressors and oppressed, but we realize that it's not always the case that differences can be explained from this angle. But under the oppression narrative, it explains everything. And what's more, if you deny this, if you point out that a person or a group might be doing something that contributes to their own condition, it's said to be victim blaming. That is unacceptable. That role is never allowed. That view is never allowed in under this narrative. So let me give you a kind of a humorous example of how this works. The Oregon Department of Education, my new favorite department of in the government right now, they put out a program called A Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction, and the goal is to, quote, improve equitable outcomes for Black, Latinx, and multilingual students. Sounds great, right? Sounds laudable. We all want outcomes for all good outcomes for all students in school, right? I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer. Of course we want this. But again, remember, this is a math curriculum, and it's designed to, quote, dismantle instances of white supremacy culture in the mathematics classroom. What? It's designed to dismantle white supremacy culture in the mathematics classroom. White supremacy. Now, if some of you are thinking that what they're talking about is that for some reason the KKK have started teaching our kids in math, you'd be wrong. What they're actually talking about is, quote, white supremacy culture cited by the document includes a focus on getting the right answer and requiring students to show their work. I'm gonna say that again. For this curriculum, their examples of white supremacy culture in math class involves getting the right answer and requiring students to show their work. Those are things that promote white supremacy, apparently. Now, the schools that my kids went to were under the guidance of these people. This is the Oregon Department of Education, right? What's going on? The underlying foundation of this is that oppression narrative. So here's the way it works. Since some minority groups don't perform as well as say white students, some white students in the class, it must be due to oppression. So wherever there's a group difference, the answer is always oppression. So if there's a standard that is creating this difference, it's got to be done away with. So the standard is you must get the right answer in math, right? We all kind of have this sort of idea that math is sort of simple that way, right? There's always a right answer and a wrong answer. But in pushing that, the Oregon Department of Education is saying that's white supremacist. And so this leads us to this ridiculous online debate. And I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but it underscores everything wrong with education today. It asks the question going around now is, does 2 + 2 = 5? If you haven't seen this discussion, do yourself a favor. If you're feeling like you just need some good humor in your life, go find an online discussion around does 2 + 2 = 5. See, educators now are claiming that saying 2 + 2 can only equal 4 is oppressive, and it comes from white supremacy. So since everything is oppressive, forcing one answer on to a math problem is also oppressive. And it's not that some students don't do well in math or they don't know math. Rather, it's our white imperialist society that is forcing them to conform. Now, okay, this is a little bit silly, right? This is obviously ridiculous, but shockingly, many people have begun to agree with this. And because this, we got to teach our kids to think, and it starts in easy ways like this. We got to learn to teach our young people how to question this narrative. I like this example because, like I said, everybody could sit back and realize this is ridiculous. But at its foundation is this oppression narrative, and it is applied in many areas in teaching. So if we can understand how it leads us to a wrong answer in this situation, kids can also learn to understand how it leads them to wrong answers in other situations. Specifically, and we'll get there in a minute, how it leads to a very anti-Christian narrative. So first, before I want to explain how we can teach our kids to question this narrative. I want to acknowledge one thing. Whenever you talk about racial differences, we do need to tread lightly. I mean, not only are people rightfully sensitive about the subject, but we can easily tread into unbiblical areas if we're not careful. The Bible makes it super clear. We're all made in the image of God, and we are infinitely valuable, period. However, having said that, we must speak the truth as well. So if we ignore obvious problems in certain communities for the sake of not offending people, that doesn't do anyone any good. So we have to teach our students to ask the right questions and the tough ones that are sometimes uncomfortable. So think about this example. I think a lot of this discussion comes from this discussion around math and white supremacy comes from the observation that many white students are getting better grades than some black students. When you look at this through the oppression narrative, the conclusion is that math classes are discriminatory. So what do we teach our kids to ask about this? What do we teach people? How do we teach them how to think? The question here is, can there be other factors that have nothing to do with white supremacy or oppression that can lead to these disparate outcomes? Is there something else that could also lead to differences in grades or outcomes in math that have nothing to do with the one thing they say it is? Well, here's a possibility. How about the single parent effect? So studies show that children of single parents perform on average significantly worse in school. And it's also true that 67% of black children are raised by single mothers compared to 36% of white children. Can't that also be have a possible impact on their math grades? See, the Oregon Department of Education has said, no, the only thing we're going to focus on is this idea of oppression. And since there's a difference in grades, there must be oppression. Math must be done away with. We can't be focused on getting the right answer or showing your work or all that stuff that we used to do, because doing that led to a disparate outcome. That's oppressive. So I bring this topic again because it's super easy, and we all know parent involvement really affects grades in schools. But I want to point out one more thing. Doesn't it feel just a little bit uncomfortable to mention some of these things? I mean, it feels just a little bit icky, especially when you're discussing things about race. Public schools kind of use that feeling that we all get to promote this super secular agenda that goes way beyond math. This oppression narrative is going to weave into every issue: math, history, racial discussions, gender differences, and even religion. We got to teach our kids to be aware of this. And so I want to go from this silly example to show you how it goes beyond math and attacks Christianity specifically. So I don't think anyone leaves their faith because they've been taught that math is oppressive. So hitting closer to home, I remember, I don't know if you guys have heard me talk before, but I've mentioned my older brother who, when I was 16, 17, he left the faith and he began to challenge me and so on. And part of his deconversion was brought on by exactly this oppression narrative as applied to religion. So he would come to me and say things like, do you know that Christianity is super oppressive and it's responsible for more deaths than any other religion in the world? For him, somewhere along the line, he had run into some typical college professor who liked to really harp on Christianity's lowlights, like the bad points of Christian history, the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the various religious wars, Galileo, or let's say the Christian West's oppression of Native Americans and Black people. So my brother really relished in explaining these things to me. He loved to add all the stuff that some Christian in the past had done, or maybe he liked to add a little hint of how America as a Christian nation had also done these horrible things. And he had learned these from his schools, and it was all under the same narrative, this oppression narrative. And so this becomes an anti-American, anti-Christian idea that is woven through every subject in classes right now. So the way it comes from the oppression narrative is this idea: since the Christian West has done since the Christian West is far richer and is more prosperous in other areas of the world, the reason has to be that we got this way through oppression. So again, there's a difference in outcome. The only possible explanation is oppression. So a student who pays attention in class right now will walk away with the idea that Christianity and America are horrible. For example, if you were to talk to most students right now, you ask them about the founding fathers, most don't know a lick about them except for the fact that they were slave owners. This is the only thing taught. We don't teach about what makes them unique. Rather, schools focus on tearing them down because acknowledging that they established a system that made America free and prosperous would go directly against the oppression narrative. It can't be due to something that they created as that happened to be better. Rather, it has to be that they got there by stomping on someone else. In summary, the big picture that is taught in schools right now is that the Christian West was a completely destructive force in history that oppressed the poor, enslaved Africans, brought death and destruction to the New World, created an oppressive, racist, homophobic, patriarchal system called America and the West. In summary, Christianity is bad. The Christian West that created America and what we have today is bad. Never before have so many Christians spent so much of their tax money to send their kids to a place that teaches them to hate their country and hate their values. It's insane. So what do we do about this? Is the answer to fly the American flag up high and talk about how America's the best things ever, and just have our only explain how Christian history and America is flawless. No. I mean, this is kind of, I think, what got us in some ways here to begin with. I think we did have a little bit too strong a force, an urge to do a rah about everything that's on our side. Instead, I think the answer is reality. Reality. The answer to the oppression narrative is reality. So, in my opinion, reality is truth, and Christianity has that truth. In this case, reality is that some people have done terrible things in the name of Christianity. America has done some evils. This is true, and we ought not hide that. But the fact is that Christianity, on balance, has been an unparalleled force for good in the world. This is the other side of the coin that the schools have left out. We got to teach our kids. Sure, we got to teach our kids some of the dark side of church history. There's plenty of it. In either way, they're going to learn about it eventually. They're going to get to college and they're going to get that one teacher that my brother had, and he's going to learn about the Inquisition and all that other stuff. However, we got to be. I want my kids especially to be aware of what we owe to Christians in the past. This is important. Again, the answer to the oppression narrative is reality. Tom Holland, who wrote a book called Dominion, he talks about the way that Christianity has brought the values that the values that we appreciate today were mostly brought from a Christian past. And so he says this. He points out the fact that most people who complain about the faults of Christianity do so based on a system that Christianity brought to the world. In schools right now, nobody learns about Christianity's role in all these things that we hold dear today. You think of women's rights. The fact is, every single country in the world that takes women's rights seriously has historically been Christian and has been influenced by Christianity to do so. The creation of universities, for all the complaints on university campuses about Christianity being closed-minded, it's due to Christians that we have universities to begin with. The value of charity and its role in, let's say, delivering medicine to poverty-stricken areas of the world. That was pretty much a Christian invention. Science, the way that the Christian West has developed modern science. The Christianity's role in ending slavery, not just in Christian countries, but also exporting that idea to the rest of the world. We don't need to be ashamed of our Christian heritage, and know that in teaching these ideas, it goes directly against the suppression narrative that is taught in schools. This is what I want my kids to know. And actually, it seems like Christians do a slightly better job of this. I think Christians tend to understand that movements and people can be a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, we learn about David in the Bible and how he was a godly man, but also sinned. We learned about Moses, who has his own faults. We kind of see how people are a mixed bag. And so this is the idea that we want to teach our kids. It's not about this. It's not just simply a long and unending stream of goodness from any idea. So I want to say again, the answer to the oppression narrative is reality, and reality tends to be very, very different than what our kids are taught in school right now. So one more aspect of this oppression narrative, and this is a tough one. It's centered around the LGBT discussion and how that is taught to our kids in school. So it's no doubt that in the past, LGBT folks have been mistreated. This is clear. So in a way to rectify this past oppression, schools are now promoting a directly anti-Christian view on gender and sexuality. So we don't have a ton of time to go into depth on this one, but as one more thing to be aware of, the view taught in school now is this: All lifestyle choices are equally valid and healthy. Your gender is determined not by biology, but by what a person feels. And anyone who denies these two facts is being homophobic or transphobic. And this is a tough one because there are few subjects I've seen that create as big of a chasm between parents and their children than this idea. The fact is that most parents don't even realize their children are starting to be taught these things as early as kindergarten. So, children are taught pretty much that just because you look like a boy doesn't mean you are a boy. Perhaps you're not. Perhaps this is something only you can know. You can choose your own gender. We kind of heard these things in the past. Know that these are coming as early as kindergarten. And for me as a dad, it's kind of frustrating because I have to begin to address these issues long before I feel like my kids are ready for them, because I know their teachers won't refrain from it. So the reality is there's a long list of things we need to prepare our kids for. LGBT issues, gender ideology, feminism, socialism, anti-racism teaching. All of these stem from these Marxist anti-oppression, these oppression narrative ideas. And the outcome is that kids right now, when they get out of school, they're going to believe that they need to constantly question their sexual identity, that the traditional family is oppressive, that America is racist and oppressive, that if you're white, you're a racist, and if you're a minority, you're a victim. And this goes in every aspect of your life. And when that encounters their parents' more traditional values, and it begins to put this separation between not only them and their parents, but also them and the church and their faith, and the ramifications are super clear when you look at the statistics of how it's affecting our kids. So I've listed only a few of the topics that our kids are going to encounter, but there's constantly more to be on guard from. The thing is, once people catch on to this idea of the oppression narrative, they'll be less likely to be taken in by a new version of it. So teaching this is super important. Now, I want to kind of explain how my thinking went on this one. As I started observing some people, students at my church and extended family and so on, as they started getting these ideas as soon as they started imbibing these ideas for themselves, I started seeing how it was breaking them apart from their church and their faith. And I started wondering, okay, what's going on here? How is it that so many who are taken in by this idea leave the faith? And I saw it, and it was Ibram X. Kendi who explained it. So Ibram X. Kendi is what they call an anti-racist educator. He's kind of a far left educator who wrote some books on the subject, and he wrote a description of liberation theology versus savior theology. And just very quickly, savior theology is the classic Christian view that man needs a savior. Liberation theology basically imbibes the oppression narrative. So he wrote the following. He wrote, savior theology, is the classic Christian idea, informs racism. Liberation theology informs anti-racism. And he writes this: are we trying to save people from their own inferiority? Or are we trying to liberate people from the oppression, from oppressive power and policy? In the Christianity that I know, Jesus was a revolutionary. And there, I think, is the problem. The oppression narrative says that the problem is not with the individual. It's not our own sin that we need to fight. We don't need a savior to save us from ourselves. Rather, it's these oppressive systems that we must fight. It's something outside of us that creates the suffering. So on this idea, pointing out that it could be my own actions that have led to where I am is unacceptable. And there's the foundation of the problem. We can't point to any faults. See, there's no one to blame for anything that happens. It is always the system. Is someone obese? That's not their fault. Is someone in jail? They're being oppressed. Is someone failing their class? It's the fault of the system. Is someone homeless? It's the result of housing policy or something. No one is held responsible for any of the decisions that led them to where they are. And none of these problems are allowed to be pointed out. When you point it out, we've got terms for these things. We call it slut shaming, fat shaming, victim blaming. All of these ideas under this rubric of anti-racism which really comes from this oppression ideology that is profoundly anti-Christian. See, the Bible says we're all sinners, and it's our sin that leads us to suffering in the world. We need a Savior to save us not from oppressive systems. We need a Savior to save us from ourselves. But when kids are taught from kindergarten all the way through college that they're of this other ideology, they're pretty much forced to choose between this biblical worldview and the view that their teachers are pushing on them. The fact is, most kids end up choosing their teacher's view, and it puts a real strain on their faith. So unfortunately, most parents don't have a strong defense for this. They don't address these issues at home. For in many cases, most kids will encounter these issues for the first time from their teachers, and they don't even realize that there's another side. So if I were to sum up the best piece of advice on this that I could think of, it's this: be sure that you are the person that introduces these ideas to your kids first. They need to be hearing these ideas taken on at home, at church, in youth group. This needs to be very clearly spelled out, because we know this. We know that public schools take an active role in indoctrination. This is not the secret is out. 1 million parents have seen what I've seen now, and their kids on Zoom classes, and their teachers pushing these ideas. So what do we do about it? So here's where I want to present kind of what I've learned, but also open it up to questions, as well as to hear how perhaps you guys have done some of this in your own families, in your church, and so on. So here's a few of my thoughts on the matter of what we got to do about it. Here's something that I don't think is a perfect solution, because not everyone can do it, and it doesn't fix everything anyway. So Christian school or homeschool. A lot of Christians choose to do that. In fact, this is what I did after starting to see this with my kids. Over about a few months ago, I moved my kids out of the public school and into Christian school. Some parents, again, choose to homeschool, so you can get the kids out of that environment. That's I fully realize not everyone can do that. On top of that, it's not a perfect solution, because it only delays the inevitable, right? So eventually your kids are going to still be out in the world. They're going to be in college. They're going to work in a coffee shop or have friends who push these ideas. They'll start hitting this. But at least this gives time to prepare. It gives time to get there at the proper pace. And this is this is why it's a good idea, but it's not the ultimate solution to this. The bottom line is, these are issues that need to be coming up at home, at school, at our youth groups, in our churches. They need to be brought up, like I said, in the environment of conversation around the table. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And the best way I found for me is to prepare my own family is just to prepare myself. I like to read about these things. I mean, I don't know if you guys go online, you'll see these crazy articles, and there'll be some outrageous thing that's happening, and people kind of get addicted to these outrageous these outrage articles where, oh my gosh, can you believe what this teacher was teaching in this school, and it's ridiculous. These are the kinds of things that you can totally bring up at home. Ask questions. What do you think about this? Usually that's, for most people, that's all it takes. The conversation is started. You bring up an article you read, a situation, and you want to know that again, the idea is being discussed. But ultimately, the goal would be to teach them how to think. Obviously, anyone can be outraged at a particular thing, but you want to get to the thinking part of it, the foundational part of it. Teaching the ideas that underline these outrageous issues. So in teaching this, I think that going to church and youth group is just not enough. They're in school far longer than they are in church and youth group. And on top of that, if you add social media, being online continues to do the job for them after they get home. What the school started, social media will continue. And I've heard it put this way: if we don't disciple our kids in this, somebody else will, and it's going to be social media. It's going to be the teachers. It's going to be all these. So really, there are constantly new crazy ideas to be on guard from. But if we teach our kids how to think, they won't be taken in by this. So in this case, I think teaching how to think is I think when teaching a kid how to think at a young age is something that's caught more than it is taught. And that means when you discuss these issues, you talk about the ideas behind them, and eventually the stuff starts to sink in. Another thing I like to do is just to involve my family in the things that I'm learning. So if I'm watching a particular something on YouTube, let's say, I like to watch Prager University videos. Great resource, by the way, guys. Prager University, short 5-minute videos on a lot of these topics: gender issues, ideology, Marxism, all these things. They're short videos, mostly for middle schoolers on up. Great resource. I sit down and watch. My family comes because if the TV's on, people are coming to watch, and it's a great way to start a discussion. Also, if you're a grandparent or involved in the church, whatever, these things should be introduced into a church, into the youth groups, into your again, just normal discussions. You're in the car, bring them up. These are interesting conversations you can have. And again, we got to find ways to have them encounter these ideas first at home before they get into the school. So I know that in some cases it feels uncomfortable. It feels a little awkward to bring up these things. A lot of times we will actually I feel like I want to avoid these things because they're kind of difficult topics for young kids, and they're topics that are kind of painful to discuss. They make us feel uncomfortable, and so we kind of avoid discussing them. But the last thing I want to say is, if we avoid discussing them, but I assure you of something, their teachers are not going to avoid it. Their teachers are actively doing it every day, and it's pushed from the highest levels. So there's just some of the stuff that I felt like was useful to me, knowing that there's an ideology behind it, that there's that the schools are pushing this, and that no matter what I do, no matter how much I try to shelter my kids from this sort of thing, they're going to eventually encounter it. I want them to be able to face it. I want them to understand where it comes from and how it is an anti-Christian idea. And ultimately, I think it's shallow and said not part of not reality. I'm curious just to kind of open up things now and hear if you got any questions, but also if you guys have strategies in your own families of ways that you've addressed issues like this. How do we incorporate this into our families and our churches? So, said, if you've got thoughts on that, I'd like to open it up and see what you guys think.
Thank you, Adrian. We've got a handful of questions that were in the group chat, which I'll pose to you if you didn't see them in real time. One question was asked early on: is there a place to get copies of the Oregon curriculum mentioned in your talk?
So I can, this was sent to me. In fact, let me see if I can actually share it here real quick. Let me see here, present. Give me just a second. So I can just share my screen here. This was what was sent to me. And this was just the first page of the thing, but it was, I don't know if you guys can see that. This was when the teacher sent me the reply, this was the letter from the Oregon Department of Education, as well as all these other groups. And this was the co-signers of all these things, are basically saying we fully support Black Lives Matter as a civil rights movement that aims to combat racism and support Black individuals. And as the letter went on, it explained how we need to back the movement and be allies and so on. All, obviously everyone can sit back and agree that Black Lives Matter, but what this was a what the actual movement is, and actually the kind of curriculum that is pushing in the schools is extremely Marxist, extremely I'd say in so many respects anti-Christian. But this was what they had sent me originally. And as far as the curriculums and all that, I think you can go to the Oregon Department of Education's website and find some of the stuff. But this was what originally was sent to me.
Adrian, someone's asking, who signed the letter that you're showing right now?
So the co-signers of this, okay, well, you're kind of looking at who the organizations are.
Okay.
Up top here. But again, this was what the Oregon Department of Education what had sent to every teacher in Oregon, including the one that was teaching my daughter.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Question number 2 that came up during your talk was this: how do we fight the LGBTQ plus agenda that's being taught in our schools, or at least present the other side? How do we as Christians come up against this view?
So first is, I think, to understand what the view is. So if you think of, so one of the ones right now that is really big is going to be the T in LGBT, and that's the transgender ideology. It's not just a group of people who happen to be who think they are a different gender than they biologically are, but rather it's a whole ideology that is pushed. That let me give you an example here. Sorry, I'm trying to explain the way I think that we need to combat this. So CNN recently put out an article, and it was talking about a law in South Dakota, and it said, actually, let me quote from it here real quick. And this author encompassed what is taught in schools right now. So they wrote about a law that basically prevents biological males from competing in women's sports. And this author at CNN wrote the following: says the order references "quote unquote" biological sex, a disputed term that refers to the sex as listed on students' original birth certificates. And he continued and wrote this: it is not possible to know a person's gender identity at birth. And for some, the sex listed on their original birth certificate is a misleading way of describing the body they have. So what is being taught is that it is not possible to know a individual's gender by simply looking at them. And what I want to do with at least my children is explain, look, if this idea has a fundamental flaw at its foundation, and it goes like this: if you ask somebody who says I feel like, let's say I'm a biological man, but I feel like a woman, there is nothing but sympathy we should be having for someone like that. This is not a beat the person over the head and judge, and this is not what we're talking about. However, when we're dealing with definitions and the reality of what's going on there, we should be able to separate the two. So how do we combat this? I think we combat it with love for all people, no matter what state they come in, and truth, because the reality is biology matters, right? So teaching my kids to not be horrified or being overly judgmental about these sorts of things, but also standing on the truth, and clearly knowing where the ideology comes from and how to define it is helpful, especially if it's done in a loving manner. So how do we fight it? I'm not one to fight the whole Oregon Department of Education. That's beyond me. I'm gonna fight with my kids, the youth group, my church, and so on, and have the people in my immediate circles be ready to understand and confront this ideology.
Tammy has asked a question in the group chat. What would you say to a Christian teacher who is told that he or she must teach the current CRT worldview in their classroom?
So I heard somebody once put it this way. He said, a lot of times people ask what we should do about something, and what is behind that question is, can we fight and not suffer the consequences? Now, I'm not saying that this person is doing that, but I think we've got it's super clear what we need to, that as people, we know one thing: we cannot push lies, period, right? So how to do that, how to actually, I think a teacher who's stuck in that situation where they're being asked to do something, I would just follow the same pattern that is taught in the Bible, and that would be to first appeal to the authority and say, look, this does go against what I believe. I don't want to do this thing. But I think in many cases people will be not given that choice. I think the more this goes on, there'll be fewer and fewer options around that, and that's where I think the rubber hits the road, whether or not we stick to our guns.
Staying with the classroom conversation, Doug has asked, which classes in high school are especially prone to these issues, or is it really all classes?
So, honestly, it's going to be all classes, because it's twofold. In some cases, the teacher is just very much on this bandwagon. It doesn't matter if it's math, it doesn't matter if it's chemistry. I remember watching some of my daughter's classes, and it was my son at this point. It was music class, and the teacher went off on some random side topic about critical race theory, and they were in the middle of learning the flute or whatever that was, and she stopped and began to give some lesson on this thing. So it can be the teacher themselves that do it, but ultimately it is the social sciences that become the place for those. The social studies classes, history classes, usually the math and sciences are a little more sheltered, just because they don't lend themselves as naturally to that sort of thing. But if I were what I ended up doing with my kids is I would watch as many of the social studies classes as possible, so I can work through those ideas with them. So they'd get a lesson. Sometimes it was fine. About half the time, I'd say about half the time, it was not great. And so I'd kind of process it with them in that evening. I'd say, hey, I watched your class. Here's what they said. What'd you think about this? And off we'd go.
Yeah, Heidi just chimed in and said her son's high school international baccalaureate English lit class and world history class are especially compromised. So definitely.
Yes, good point. English literature is, yeah.
And so and several questions have popped in the last couple of seconds, but Adrian, you keep talking about your kids. What is their point of view in all of this? There's mom and dad and kind of looking over their shoulder, but what is their perspective on all this? Do they have, does their ear get, does it burn their ear a little bit as to what's going on as well?
So, yes and no. Here's just to be honest, sometimes I'll get on my high horse and I'll watch my kids and they kind of roll their eyes and there's dad again doing his thing. And it's kind of hard not to, I'm dad, right? Dad, kids will roll their eyes at stuff. But I wasn't sure how things were going. And then, and if my daughter is still on here, which I think she is, I'm gonna tell a slightly embarrassing story, but I was very proud of her for this one. She was in a class that did the Columbus Day lesson, and during that lesson, the teacher basically went off on a rant about how much of a jerk Columbus was. And my daughter emailed a very simple question. This was on her own initiative, and said, why is it that we only learn about how much of a jerk Columbus was? And the teacher replied, well, that's because, we want to learn the bad as well as the good. And darn it, if I wasn't so proud of my daughter, she replied, well, then why do we only learn the good of the Native American cultures that were there and never learn the bad as well? Why is this only our own side that we learn only the bad? And the teacher again responded with, well, we think we should allow people to celebrate their own cultures however they wish. And so my daughter's response was, well, then why don't you allow us to celebrate our culture in its positive notes as well as its negatives? And so anyway, every once in a while you kind of get a sense that the lights are coming on and it's hitting home. And for all that, rolling of the eyes, it gets going. And I sometimes the conversations are fantastic. Other times they're kind of dry and I feel like I'm preaching, but I know it's getting there.
Just a reminder to everyone still with us today.
You're on mute.
Oh,
Brian.
I am. Am I there?
Nope.
Back?
Maybe I can't hear you.
Byron, can you?
Oh, so I apologize. I went on mute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So a reminder to folks with us tonight, if you want to ask Adrian a question, if I don't want to mess up your question. So if there's a question you want to ask specifically, go down to reactions, click on raise hand. It'll look like this. And then we can take your question live via video. Next question would be, who approves these public school curriculums? The way you present it, this person says, I guess most people would not agree with it. Why has there not been public outrage about this?
Well, I think there's some, but let me tell you our experience in our school. Part of what I want to do in raising the alarm is trying to help people understand that this is a problem. When we noticed a lot of stuff happening in my kid's school, my wife went on a Facebook page that is for various parents in my kids, my daughter's class. So on the Facebook page, she mentioned her concern, and some of these people were Christians, some were not. It was just all over the map. Gave specific examples of what was being taught to their kids. And few parents kind of commented, yeah, that's probably not so great. Almost zero engagement in this issue, almost zero. It was like, it was frustrating because again, we knew enough parents that disagreed with this, but it just didn't make an impact. So why is it that there's not enough outrage? I think when teachers do stuff like this and then the parents shut their mouth, there's no reason to not do it. I had a long conversation with the principal at the time, very respectful, but I at the end of the day, if there was 50 people who had called the principal, that would have been a different story. I was just one guy.
Next question would be, this person wants to know, if the Equality Act passes, how will that affect school curriculum?
I'm going to have to pass on this one. I'm not familiar enough with the way that would affect curriculums. In my opinion, I can't imagine they wouldn't get anything but worse. So there's my answer.
Okay, fair enough. All right, here's a question. How would you answer someone who might say, as a well-equipped apologist for 20 years, you should have known better? What made you decide to put your kids into public school in the first place? That's
actually a really good question. And so it was to just a quick background on how it went. We began homeschooling our kids, and the public school we put them in eventually was a charter school in Sherwood. To me, I should have known better is what I thought after the fact. In my mind, charter school run inside of a church in Sherwood, Oregon, which is a fairly conservative area, I thought it was safe. Wrong. So I should have known better, because I kind of expected more, and I was wrong.
Real quickly, I'm being told that we're going to toss. Herb, are you on the Zoom here. The question on the Equality Act, if that passes, what that would do to school curriculum. Herb, can you address that at all if you're with us?
I sure can. So I commend everybody to Google the Equality Act. I believe it's HR 5 or SB 5 pending in Congress. And basically it would eliminate any religious defenses to anybody who wants to oppose exactly what Adrian's talking about. And even though it's focused on LGBTQ stuff, it would effectively muzzle anybody with a religious point of view, not only in business, not only with respect to employment, but also it would be a part of education. And there's already cases pending to challenge religious exemptions in favor of religious schools. So basically the Equality Act would be catastrophic. Things are bad enough, but the Equality Act will be catastrophic. The other thing I'll say, which Adrian alluded to a moment ago, you can't go in and fight these battles by yourself. You need to go with 50 of your closest friends. And preferably all of those people are the people who are the leaders of the PTA and the other volunteer groups in the school, and tell the principal, if you want us to continue supporting the school and volunteering around this place, you're going to change your tune and you're going to knock this on the head. And if 50 people who are instrumental to the volunteer core of every school say, our participation is contingent upon you teaching our kids what they need to know and not what somebody in Salem wants them to know, that's the only way you're going to combat this. And as I posted in the chat, I'm a veteran of these education wars going back 10 years. And I've lost almost all the cases. And part of the reason is the institutional stuff that Adrian's been talking about. And the other thing is Christian parents wimp out instead of going to war because they're afraid their kids are going to be ostracized or something. So they just decide to do nothing. And they leave their kids in school and they continue to volunteer, and their kids continue to be indoctrinated and lured away from the faith.
Thank you, Herbert.
Other than that, I don't have anything to say about this.
Okay. All right. All right, Adrian, back to you. This viewer says, thanks for pointing out the worldview discrepancy, salvation ideology versus liberation ideology. Are there any Bible verses that address this, or books of the Bible that talk to this?
So at the foundation is that idea of salvation from our own sin, our own it's our own doing, in a sense that we are individuals responsible for our own situation. And I think that's, as if you're asking what part of the Bible talks about this, I think that's basically the whole thing. But here's an example of something that I ran into that shows the wisdom of the Bible. So when in the Old Testament, sorry, the modern view of that we get is we have a way of sort of separating again the oppressed and the oppressor, and that under that view, if someone, say, is poor, in our view of things, or at least this oppression narrative view of things, that person gets, in some regards, special special dispensation, as it were, that they are oppressed, right? So if someone is underprivileged in some way financially, they are to be they're usually in the right when it comes to if they're fighting a cause. I'm trying to explain this. The Bible says no. The Bible says reality is what matters. The Old Testament gives a very interesting law that at first it confused me until I realized how it applies today. It says, "You shall not render favor to the poor in judgment, nor shall you look upon the rich." And it's saying, judge righteously, not just based on the reality of the facts, not based on the fact that somebody is poor or somebody is rich. Under the oppression narrative, it separates it and says, no, because this person is poor, we're going to side with them. When the Bible says, no, you don't side with the rich, nor do you side with the poor. You side with the truth. And when I read that verse, it just kind of struck me like, whoa, God knew that we have this tendency to either go one direction or the other. I think in the past we tended to go towards, to favor the rich. I think under the oppression narrative, we say we favor the poor in judgment, and the Bible says, do neither, do according to the truth. And I love that verse. It really is applicable in this case.
Yeah, Heidi says her high school freshman is listening and saying, yes, that's exactly what we're being taught. So it's frightening. I mean, Adrian, we've got just a couple more questions and a couple more minutes. Why are you, at the core of all of this, you're a dad, you're a husband, and former teacher. Why so passionate, and why do we need to be equally passionate? Kind of to Herb's point, why do we need to get fired up about this as well?
So for me, on a personal journey, I have a large family and lots of cousins and aunts and all these things, and I've got I've watched over the last decade as the members of my family, as well as just kids in our youth groups and our being raised in homeschools, in good Christian churches, in excellent families, 2-parent families that taught them the Bible. They memorized the Bible. They went to church every week. They did it right, like it was done. If I were to say, how would I like to be as a parent? I would imitate these families. And then 2 years into college, they were lost. Far in the and I think, what the heck happened? These guys, I watched these families put their heart and soul. They bled for these kids, and at the end of the day, they lost them because of this thing that they missed out on. Now, it's not necessarily that they missed out on it, but rather this is what got them. So that's not to say they never did address these issues and so on, but I see in so many cases the answers weren't there. They encountered these ideas for the first time when they hit high school and college, and it was all the structure that the parents had worked to build just was torn down. And it breaks my heart because I know, seeing it now as for myself, how much stinking effort it is to raise these kids. I don't want to leave that hole in our armor, as it were. So that's why I'm passionate about it. I've seen enough of this, and then knowing how hard it is how many of these situations break up families. My own family was kind of broken up that way because of these issues. I've seen a lot of it in the church where parents don't talk, children don't talk to their parents, and vice versa. It's heartbreaking.
Adrian, this person's asking very practically, if they want to go forward and address the school, is it to the school board, the principal, or the teacher? Where do they start?
So I'm going to answer it the best I know, and I would like to pass it back to Herb here because he's got so much more experience here. So in my experience, it started very, very directly to the teacher that did it. It's very hard to catch it because it might be in class, and the kids are coming off of Zoom now. I'm starting to go back to school. It's hard to address it. For me, it worked out because not only were these did I happen to watch it live, but they were actually recording the sessions, and I managed to get the recording. I reviewed the whole recording again, gave excerpts of exactly where I felt things were bad, just emailed that to the teacher and to the principal. The principal, and by the way, because I did it respectfully and never got to an argument, we had a very calm, good discussion. And I also made it very clear that if things don't change, I'm going to pull my kids out of school. I ended up pulling my kids out of school. I think it needs to escalate from there. And that's what I hear Herb's suggestion here.
Well, I agree, both for biblical reasons and also for practical reasons. You start with the people who are actually doing things. And I think it's important to remember a lot of teachers don't have a lot of choice in what they're doing. So they're going to circle the wagon. They're either true believers or they're kind of co-opted by the system. But you start with them, you work your way up to the principal. Eventually, you may work your way up to the school board. What you ultimately have to remember is you try and identify where the pressure is coming from that insists on this happening. And I think we need to keep in mind there's a lot of Christians in the public school system who are absolutely trapped. And sometimes you can talk to them and they will step up and they will do what they can. But ultimately, what it takes is people acting together and starting with the people who are closest to them and then working up the chain of command. And part of the problem that's underscoring everything that Adrian is talking about is that increasingly schools are run either from Salem or from Washington, D.C. So it becomes much harder to get at the people who are really pushing the agenda, but you got to start at the bottom and work your way up.
And if I can say one more thing here, I never felt, now this might not always be the case, but I never felt like my kids were ostracized in any way. I felt like they, again, bringing it up in a calm, professional manner. Am I muted? No. Okay, good. So bringing it up that way, I never felt that kind of backlash, but I have heard enough stories where it gets awkward for the poor kid too. So it's such a frustrating situation where the all the people in the escalating chain may be against you in the sense of ideology. So in my case, the teacher happened to be of this to be a firm believer in this. The principal was, and then you went up to the school board, and every single member of the school board wasn't just was basically a radical leftist on the school board. A whole lot of them, and this was Sherwood. So it's just frustrating to see that.
All right, Adrian, we've got just one more question. First, I want to remind everybody that, yes, this exact video will be available on the website tomorrow. So we invite you to check that out. And also join us back on May 21st. That is the next Friday Forum. And again, you don't have to pre-register, just show up for that. But again, that's at the Ambassadors Forum website. And again, that's May 21st. Adrian, last two questions will be this. One, several are asking for your notes that you were just going, super quick, and they want to look at your notes again and be able to dive in deeper. Are those available? Can they be made available?
So before the talk, I had actually talked to Byron here about setting up a link to some of this stuff. This is where I have failed and I hadn't posted them yet. Byron, if I want to post them, how do we do that?
Well, at this point, I think we'll just have to put a link into a future newsletter.
Let's do it. Okay, watch those newsletters, and I'll have a link, not just with the notes, but also with my suggested readings when it comes to prepping yourself. So I want to give 5 or 6 resources where if you're stuck in traffic or waiting for to pick up your kid from soccer or something, you start getting yourself educated.
Awesome. Okay, final question is this. Should I ask my church to support me in my fight against the system? What can they do to help support me?
So I think the obvious answer is yes, and that's why you have a whole church to find out in what way you can do that. I think churches are local, so a lot of the people are in the same school district. On top of that, having support from the church doesn't necessarily mean fighting it at the school level. There's another way you can win this one, and that is this stuff needs to be in the youth groups. If it's not, so your church can support you most immediately by adding this to the youth groups. People say it feels political. Yes, because everything has become political, and this is now the politics of this have entered into the church and are destroying it. And so if we don't fight on this, it's basically a war that only one side is fighting. And so if we don't address these issues in the youth group and just continue to whistle past the graveyard, we're gonna lose. So that would be my immediate first thing that the church can do to support. How you fight the schools, talk to Herb.
All right. Well, we look forward to gathering together again in May. Adrian, our thanks for a lot to think on and act on as well. Again, the website is theambassadorsforum.com. We'll look forward to seeing everyone in May, and have a great night, everybody. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.